Step into the shadows where whispered tales linger. In this playlist, we uncover urban legends, stories born in back alleys, abandoned roads, and the corners of your mind. Some say they're just myths, others aren't so sure. Listen if you dare.
The villagers had long whispered about the woman in red. They spoke of her in hushed voices, afraid that if her name was spoken too boldly, she might hear and come walking from the shadows of the manor that still brooded over the fields. Children dared each other to creep near its blackened gates, but even the most reckless never stayed long. The house had not been lived in for more than a century, yet every shutter seemed to watch, and the silence inside was said to hold its own breathing. It was said she was betrayed on her wedding night. A crimson gown clung to her body when she had gone to meet her groom, but he had gone instead to another. Madness had carried her through the halls, a storm of lace and rage, until her scream was heard for the last time. By dawn, the floorboards of the master's chamber were slick, and her body was never buried. Some claimed she had been bricked into the walls. Others swore she had vanished, carried away by the fury that birthed her spirit. No one walked the halls after dusk, not even the keepers who tried briefly to make the manor into a boarding house in later years. Tenants never lasted more than a week, each left with faces pale and sickly, unwilling to describe what they had seen. One caretaker had been found crawling down the drive in the dead of night, his mouth full of blood, his tongue bitten nearly through. He would not speak a word again. He simply clutched his ears whenever night came, shaking his head, as though he could still hear her screaming. It was a story that should have remained nothing but a tale for fireside nights. But curiosity is its own curse. And so when Jonathan first came to the village, he could not ignore the looming silhouette of the abandoned house. He was a man who had known betrayal himself and fancied himself hardened against fear. The stories only amused him. He saw in the whispers nothing but the drama of country folk, eager to give their boredom a phantom to chase. The more they warned him to stay away, the stronger his urge grew to enter. The iron gates leaned on their hinges like tired guardians when Jonathan pushed through. The drive was overgrown, the path buried beneath weeds and creeping ivy that pulled at his ankles. The manor rose above him, windows blank and gaping. As he approached, the air grew colder, though the sun had not yet dipped behind the trees. Each step seemed to press into silence deeper than the last, as though the world beyond the property had ceased to exist. Even the crows that nested in the branches outside the walls did not follow him across the threshold. The front doors were half rotted, but they yielded with a groan that echoed like a warning into the cavernous hall. Dust lay thick as snow on the black and white tiles. His boots left marks behind him like wounds in untouched flesh. Cobwebs laced the corners and banisters, and a stench of damp wood and something older, like rusted iron, lingered. He almost turned back at the odor, for it did not belong to mere decay but to something fouler. Yet his pride drove him forward. He lit his lantern and climbed the stairs, the light casting long shadows that bent and reached across the walls. Portraits hung crooked, their subjects' faces obscured by mold and peeling varnish, yet he felt their eyes following him. At the landing he paused, for he thought he heard a faint scuff on the floor above. It was not the settling of the house. It was deliberate, measured, and slow. Jonathan whispered into the silence, calling out, as though some vagrant might have taken shelter in the old place. No reply came, only another sound, the soft drag of fabric across wood, like silk trailing behind a moving figure. His stomach tightened, though he clenched his jaw against the dread creeping over him. He climbed further. The master's chamber lay at the end of the corridor. Its doors, once grand, now sagged open like broken teeth. He pushed one aside, and his lantern revealed a room ravaged by time. The bed was a ruin of splintered wood and torn fabric. The fireplace yawned black and cold. Yet the air here was heavier, thicker, and he felt a pulse in it as though the room itself inhaled. On the far wall, a long mirror stood in a frame of tarnished silver. Its glass had darkened with age, yet something moved within it that did not match his reflection. He froze, breath caught in his throat. The figure in the mirror wore a gown the color of fresh blood. It gleamed even in the weak light, as though the fabric had just been dipped in something wet. The face above it was pale, stretched, with eyes too wide, and lips drawn tight into a slit of fury. Her hair hung in tangled strands as if torn from her scalp. Her hands, long-fingered, were slick and dripping, though nothing fell onto the floor. Jonathan staggered back, raising his lantern, but the glass did not show him. It showed only her. Slowly, she began to lean forward, pressing her palms against the other side. The surface of the mirror rippled under her touch. Her eyes locked with his, and a sound filled the room. Not a scream, but a rasping breath that carried pain and hatred in every shudder. The glass began to crack beneath her fingers, fine lines spreading like veins. A drop of red seeped from the fractures and slid down the silver. The lantern flame guttered, throwing the room into jerking shadows. Jonathan's instincts finally tore him toward the door, but before he could run, the sound of steps echoed behind him in the corridor he had just walked. Quick, heavy, relentless, like feet rushing toward him. He spun, but the hall was empty. Yet the steps did not stop, they grew closer, until he felt the tremor in the floor. And then came the whisper, so near it tickled the back of his neck. A woman's voice, broken with rage, murmuring words he could not understand. He fled, stumbling down the stairs, the lantern shaking wildly. Behind him, the dragging of fabric followed, steady and unhurried, as though she knew escape was impossible. The front doors slammed shut before he reached them, the sound booming like a cannon. He clawed at the handles, but they did not budge. The air thickened with the scent of iron, so strong it choked him. He turned, his light quivering against the staircase. She stood halfway down, her crimson gown spreading like liquid across the steps, staining the wood where no color should remain. Her head lolled to one side, neck bent at an angle too sharp to be natural. Her eyes were nothing but pits of black, yet he felt them burrow into him, pulling at his breath, his will, his very pulse. Her mouth opened, slow and tearing, wider than flesh should permit. The scream that tore out shook the walls, rattled the glass, and drove Jonathan to his knees with his hands pressed against his skull. He felt the sound not only in his ears but inside his bones, vibrating his teeth until he tasted blood. When the scream stopped, silence rushed in like a flood. He dared to look up. She was no longer on the stairs. She was standing over him. The hem of her gown brushed his hand, wet and sticky, and when he drew it back, his skin was smeared red. Her hand reached down, fingers curling like hooks, and though he tried to crawl backward, his body would not obey. It was as if the air itself had seized him, pinning him for her touch. The lantern shattered when it struck the floor, plunging him into darkness. He felt her fingers at his throat, colder than ice, sharper than blades. They pressed without weight, yet stole his breath. He gagged and thrashed, but his limbs were clumsy, as though she had drained the strength from them. The last thing he saw before his vision clouded was the glimmer of her teeth, not quite human, long and jagged, parting in a smile that promised nothing but agony. The villagers said later that no one saw Jonathan leave the manor. His belongings remained at the inn, his horse untouched in the stable. Days later, when a farmer ventured near the grounds, he claimed he saw a trail of red drops leading from the manor steps into the earth, as though the house itself had bled. And on the wind that night, when the church bell tolled, a scream carried across the fields, one that left every dog howling and every window shuttered tight. The house did not release Jonathan. That much was clear. The villagers kept their distance, though they gathered in low circles at the tavern to whisper about what had happened. Some insisted he had left under cover of night, ashamed to admit fear. Others shook their heads, claiming that the house never let go once it took notice of someone. By the third day, when the innkeeper's wife opened his room and found his bed still made, his coat still hanging from the peg, and his journal half written upon the desk, their whispers curdled into silence. No one dared go up to the manor to look for him. No one dared disturb the Red Lady once she had chosen. But his journal did not stay still. It vanished from the inn 2 nights later, and in its place was left a single page. Torn, damp, and stained at the corners, it bore writing not in Jonathan's hand, but in a scrawl that seemed carved into the paper. The words were smeared, written as though in something thick and drying. They read only, "She wears me. She wears me now." The page was burned by the priest at dawn, But that did not unwrite it. The villagers carried its words in their minds, heavy as lead, and they slept less soundly from then on. Mothers pressed their children to stay inside when the shadows grew long, and fathers barred doors earlier each evening. The manor, once just a ruin to be avoided, now seemed to lean closer in the night, as though it grew teeth. What none of them knew was what Jonathan endured in those hours after the lantern went dark. His body was dragged, though no hands touched him, up the staircases, across corridors that warped and lengthened, until he could not tell if he was within walls or inside some cavern of nightmare. The air thickened with rot, choking his nostrils, slicking his skin. At intervals he blacked out, only to wake in different rooms, sprawled across broken furniture or pressed into corners where the wallpaper peeled like flayed skin. Always she was near. Sometimes he heard her gown dragging inches from his ear. Sometimes her breath at the nape of his neck, and sometimes her face in flashes, close enough to see the pores stretched around her mouth, the veins bulging in her pallid cheeks, the hollow where a tongue should have been. Her presence was constant, as though she had stepped inside him. When he tried to scream, the sound did not leave his throat. It caught and tore until blood rose in his mouth. She delighted in this. He could feel it, not in sight or sound, but as a rush of cold through his veins, a pleasure that was not his own. His agony was hers to wear. Time dissolved in the manor. He could not measure hours, only the cycles of torment. One moment he was sprawled on the ballroom floor, where rats scuttled through the hollowed sockets of chandeliers, their claws tickling his skin as they ran across him. The next, he was crawling in the cellar, his palms pressing into damp patches that squelched with a warmth too foul to be water. He brought his hand up once to his lantern's faint glow, and saw it black with clotted matter that smelled of copper and rot. He gagged until he vomited, and the stench grew heavier, for what spilled from his mouth did not look like what he had eaten that day. It was thick, dark, crawling with things that twitched even as they slid onto the stones. The mirror followed him. Wherever he turned, there was glass, sometimes in the curve of a shattered window pane, sometimes in the sheen of water pooled in the cellar floor, sometimes in a frame hanging where no frame had been before. And always she was inside it, the red lady, crimson gown gleaming, eyes hollow, fingers lifting toward him with a promise of touch that burned colder than frost. The reflections did not mimic her, they carried her forward. Each time the glass cracked, he swore she grew closer, her limbs stretching, her grin widening into something skeletal. At last she began to speak. Not words as men speak, but a rasping chorus that filled the walls. At first he thought it was laughter, a broken wheeze like ribs splitting. Then it formed syllables, though they slid across each other half-swallowed. They all danced, they all bled, they all belong. Jonathan pressed his hands to his ears until his nails tore the skin, but her voice pushed through bone itself. He knew he would hear it, even if deafness claimed him. The gown brushed him once more. Its hem touched his ankle, and he screamed not in pain, but in revelation. The cloth was not cloth. It was skin, peeled and dyed with endless layers of blood, stitched together with strands of black hair. When she moved, the gown writhed as though still alive, faces pressing against it from beneath, mouths opening in voiceless cries before sinking back into the folds. One face he recognized, his own. That night, the villagers heard noises from the manor, though they had barred their windows. Screams, but not just one man's, dozens, hundreds, overlapping in agony. A cacophony of voices, male and female, young and old, all rising and falling as though the walls themselves had been filled with the dying. Dogs tore at their chains, howling, trying to flee. The church bell tolled without human hands, each note vibrating through the ground, splitting plaster in the cottages nearest the square. By morning, silence again. The manor stood as before, yet a stain spread across its upper windows, red as a smear of fresh paint, though no one dared go near enough to see what it truly was. The innkeeper's wife found another page under her door, though she swore she had locked every bolt. It was heavier than parchment should be, damp as though newly torn from flesh. Written upon it in jagged letters was a single sentence: I am inside the gown. I can feel her wear me. The morning after the second page appeared, The village felt hollow. People moved slower, voices muted, as though they feared even the air might carry their words up the hill to the manor. The priest ordered more candles lit in the church, but even those flames guttered, weak and sickly. He announced he would climb to the manor and bless its halls, drive out whatever darkness lingered there. The villagers begged him not to, but duty bound him. By dusk, he walked the lane with crucifix in one hand and a book of rites in the other. He never returned. That night, the bell tolled again. Not once, but in a steady rhythm, toll after toll, each strike deepening until the village windows trembled. The sound carried not holiness but hunger, as though the iron itself rang with a voice. Some claimed they heard the priest calling for help between the tolls. Others swore his voice had joined the chorus of screams. At dawn, the bell stopped, and silence crushed the fields. The crucifix was later found in the mud of the lane, bent as though by fire, yet untouched by flame. The priest's body was never seen. Inside the manor, Jonathan no longer knew himself. The Red Lady had grown bolder. She no longer stalked behind or taunted from the glass. She walked with him. He could feel her hand wrapped around his wrist, though his eyes showed nothing there. Her nails sank into him, carving deeper with each step. His flesh blackened where she touched, as though rotting alive. He screamed, tore at his skin, and his blood streaked the walls. But the wounds healed in grotesque ways, the gashes stitched with strands of crimson thread, binding him in her cloth. At times he found himself dressed in scraps of her gown. Strips of red clung to him, pulsing faintly, moving when he tried to tear them free. They grew warm, and with the warmth came voices, hundreds, thousands, all sobbing in his ears. He realized then, each strip was a piece of someone who had entered before him. She wore them all. The gown was not just made of flesh, it was made of souls, pressed flat, screaming forever in its folds. The manor warped further as she pressed herself deeper into him. Rooms shifted with each blink. Doors no longer led to hallways, but to chambers filled with horrors. One opened into a nursery, toys scattered on the floor. Yet each doll's porcelain head was shattered, and tiny teeth lay among the fragments, some still wet. Another room had no floor at all, only a black pit filled with writhing forms, pale limbs clawing upward, nails screeching against the stone as if begging him to fall and join them. Their faces bore his features, all twisted in torment. He stopped eating. Hunger gnawed, but the thought of food was sickening. When he raised his hand to his mouth, it did not obey. Instead, his hand forced itself into his throat until he gagged. He felt her fingers guiding his own, as though she practiced how his body would move when she wore it entirely. He bit down to stop it, blood filling his mouth. She laughed inside his skull, a bubbling, wet chuckle. The villagers tried to fight in their way. They nailed iron across their doors, hung wreaths of rowan and hawthorn, carved protective symbols on their thresholds. Yet each night the same red stain appeared larger across the manor windows. On the third night, a fog rolled down from the hill. Thick, choking, red-tinged fog that seeped into every crack and under every door. People gagged in their beds, clawing at their throats, convinced they were drowning. Livestock choked in the fields, their corpses slick with blood from burst eyes and ears. In the morning, the fog was gone, but the village well was black. When they drew buckets, the water was thick, unclean, carrying the smell of iron. Children cried from thirst, but mothers slapped cups from their hands. Better to die thirsty than to drink what she offered. One man, desperate, climbed to the manor with a torch, intent on burning it down. He never even touched the walls. The villagers who watched from afar saw him reach the gates. The torchlight flickered, sputtered, then died though the wind was still. He froze, staring up at the house. Slowly his head turned toward the watching villagers, though his body did not move. Even from the distance, they saw his face split into a smile too wide, his jaw cracking until it hung unnaturally low. Then he dropped to his knees and his body collapsed inward as though crushed by unseen hands. His ribs tore out through his skin, his head snapped back, and from within his body something red and glistening poured out, thread-like, weaving itself into the shape of a dress before collapsing back to nothing. The man was left as a hollow sack of flesh, twitching once, then still. By then, the villagers no longer spoke of stopping her. They only spoke of survival. Doors were barred, windows boarded. Children were kept from the fields. Yet none of that mattered, for the Red Lady was no longer contained within the manor. Her influence spilled, creeping into the hearts of those nearby. Some awoke screaming in the night, clawing at their own skin until blood spattered the walls. Others walked into the forest and were never seen again, leaving only trails of red drops on the leaves. Jonathan, trapped within the manor, finally understood. She did not haunt the house. The house was her body, her lungs, her veins. The floors pulsed when she breathed. The walls wept when she hungered. And he was inside her now, being digested slowly, made ready to be worn. Each time he passed a mirror, his reflection showed less of him and more of her, the crimson gown blooming across his chest, her face stretching over his like a mask, her hollow eyes staring back. He clawed at his own reflection until the glass cracked, but the pieces fell not to the ground, but into his own mouth, slicing his tongue, filling him with blood. He began to lose his voice. Each time he tried to scream, a different voice emerged. Sometimes it was the priest. Sometimes it was the man who had died at the gates. Sometimes it was the soft wail of a child. The lady was replacing him. Layer by layer, he was becoming another fold in her gown, another voice in her scream, another face pressed into her skin. And in his last lucid moment, he begged, though he knew no one could hear, that death might find him before she did. But the Red Lady does not kill, she keeps. By the 4th week, the village was unraveling. Fields went untilled, children coughed with thirst, and each night the manor glowed faintly red on the hill, as though a furnace burned within its stone walls. People no longer dared to speak of Jonathan by name. They called him the Taken One. Some claimed they still saw him at night, stumbling along the edge of the fog, waving for help. But those who approached found nothing there but the smell of rot and a faint trail of bloody footprints that ended without explanation. The new priest arrived from the neighboring parish, sent after word of the village's troubles reached beyond their valley. He was a stern man, broad-shouldered, lips pressed into a line as though he had already decided the villagers were weak in faith. He carried with him a heavy Bible, vials of holy water, and a cross of wrought iron that he swore had silenced demons before. When the villagers begged him not to go near the manor, he scolded them. The devil takes ground only where cowardice permits it. He would perform a cleansing. He demanded their aid. Too frightened to resist, they gathered what they could, candles, salt, incense, and followed him up the lane at dusk. The gates, rusted and bent, creaked open as though welcoming them. The air was wrong even before they crossed the threshold. A heaviness pressed down, sour with the smell of copper and decay. Some of the younger men retched and begged to turn back, but the priest's voice thundered with scripture, dragging them onward. When they entered the manor, the doors slammed shut, though no hand touched them. The great hall swallowed their light. Candles burned dimmer here, flames shrinking low as though smothered. The priest planted his cross before the staircase and began his rites, Latin spilling from his tongue in sharp cadence. The villagers lit candles around him, forming a circle, whispering prayers of their own. For a moment, hope flickered. The shadows seemed to shrink, the stench receded. Some dared to think it might work. Then came the dragging sound. From the upper floors, silk across wood, slow, deliberate, closer with each step. The priest raised his voice, shouting scripture. His cross gleamed in the candlelight, and then the sound stopped. The silence was worse. Every mirror in the hall began to tremble, frames rattling, glass vibrating with a high, keening pitch. Faces formed in the reflections, men, women, children, their mouths opening in silent screams. And then she appeared. At the top of the stairs, the Red Lady stood. Her gown spilled down the steps like a river of flesh, wet and glistening, the folds twitching as though filled with something alive. Her head lolled, eyes black voids, mouth slack and wide. The priest's voice faltered for the first time, but he forced it back, sprinkling holy water in great arcs. The droplets hissed when they struck the banister, leaving black scars in the wood. She descended slowly, each step echoing like a heartbeat. When the water touched her gown, it writhed and shrieked. Not her voice, but the voices of dozens, hundreds, all rising in agony. The villagers screamed and stumbled backward. One man tried to flee, but the doors slammed shut again, the wood groaning like a dying animal. His body crumpled against it, bones snapping, sucked into the grain as though the house itself devoured him. His muffled screams bled through the wood until only silence remained. The priest stood his ground, sweat running down his face. He pressed the cross forward. "By the blood of the Lamb I cast thee out," he bellowed. For a heartbeat the Red Lady froze. Her head twitched. Her mouth closed, then split wider than before, tearing at the corners until her face nearly opened to her ears. A sound erupted. Not a scream, but laughter. Deep, guttural, and layered, as though 100 throats spoke at once. The iron cross shuddered in the priest's hand, glowing faintly, then searing hot. He cried out, dropping it. It hit the floor with a hiss, melted to slag before their eyes. The mirrors shattered. Shards burst outward, slicing through flesh. Villagers fell, clutching their faces, their arms, their throats. Blood spattered across the tiles. Some did not fall. They were pulled into the glass instead, sucked screaming into the shards. Their bodies warped, flattened, until only their faces remained, pressed into the crimson folds of her gown. The priest raised his Bible in one last defiance, shouting words that broke into sobs. The lady reached him in a single glide, her hand plunging into his chest without breaking flesh. His body arched, eyes bulging as something was torn from within him. His scream did not leave his mouth. It poured from hers. His soul bled into her gown, his face blooming across its surface, wailing silently. His corpse collapsed in on itself like rotten fruit, skin folding, bones snapping until nothing but a husk remained. The villagers who survived fled deeper into the manor, chased by the dragging of her gown. They found themselves in corridors that twisted endlessly, rooms repeating, staircases leading back to where they began. Panic set in. One woman clawed at the walls until her fingers broke, shrieking for an exit that never appeared. Another beat his head against a locked door until his skull split, preferring death to capture. Those who ran too slowly were caught. Their bodies did not fall, only their voices, stolen mid-scream, added to the chorus swelling within her. When dawn broke, the survivors stumbled back to the village. Their eyes were vacant, their hair gone white. They would not speak of what they saw. They would not speak at all. They sat in silence until death took them days later, their mouths stretched in wide, frozen grins. The Red Lady was stronger now. The villagers could feel it. Each night, her glow from the manor burned brighter, and her scream carried further across the fields. Those who closed their eyes saw her face in their dreams. Those who tried to leave the village found themselves circling back to the same road, the manor looming always at the horizon. The exorcism had not banished her. It had fed her. And now she was no longer bound by walls. She was coming for them all. The village was a carcass by the 5th week. Doors hung open not from welcome, but because their hinges had snapped under the pressure of unseen hands. Windows cracked in patterns that resembled veins, black mold creeping across the glass. The air smelled perpetually of iron, so thick that people carried rags soaked in vinegar against their faces to keep from gagging. No birds sang. No livestock stirred. Only the bell, tolling now of its own accord at hours that made no sense, sometimes at midnight, sometimes at dawn, sometimes in endless stretches until the air itself quivered. The Red Lady no longer lingered in her manor. She came down into the streets. At first it was whispers. Villagers swore they heard silk dragging along the cobbles outside their shutters. Then came the knocks, 3 measured raps against the wood, always followed by silence. Those foolish enough to answer found their homes empty, yet a strip of red cloth lay upon the threshold, pulsing faintly. Anyone who touched it vanished by the following morning, leaving behind only a smear of blood across their bed. Jonathan still lingered in her grasp, though he was no longer a man. His face appeared on walls, in basins of water, in panes of broken glass. His mouth always moved, but no sound came. Children swore they saw him standing at the edge of the square at night, twitching as though held by strings. His body, when glimpsed, was draped in tatters of crimson that slithered and shifted, as though they had a life of their own. He would lift his hands as if begging, but when people looked longer, those hands ended not in fingers but in long hooks of bone. The villagers tried to bind themselves together, to keep light burning through the night, but flames weakened in her presence. Candles shrank to nothing, oil lamps snuffed without warning. Darkness became her herald. With it came the scratching of nails along walls, the sudden freezing of air, and then the chorus of voices, the endless victims bound within her gown, wailing like a storm through every room. Families pressed to the floor, covering their ears, but still the cries vibrated their bones, rattled their teeth until gums bled. Madness spread faster than hunger. One woman drowned her infant in the trough, screaming that she could no longer bear to hear the child's voice echoing in the night. Another man tore out his own eyes with a shard of glass, babbling that the lady wore them each time he blinked. Even those who remained sane withered. They slept little, ate less, and trembled at each sound. The priest's absence left no shield. The church itself began to rot, wood splintering, stone blackening with stains that grew each night. The crucifix above the altar twisted, its figure warping into something long-limbed and mouthless. Parishioners who sought refuge there emerged screaming, their hair white, their tongues swollen until they choked. At night, the Red Lady made herself visible. She drifted along the lanes, her gown spreading behind her like a tide. It slithered into homes through cracks, under doors, up chimneys. People burned their floors to stop it, but fire did not halt her. The gown would pulse and twitch, and faces pressed outward, their silent mouths opening against the wood. Some villagers saw their loved ones in those folds, eyes wide with agony, lips mouthing their names. Few resisted. Mothers unbarred doors at the sight of their children's faces. Husbands collapsed, weeping at the soundless cries of their wives. When they touched the gown, they were gone in an instant. Sucked in, absorbed, their flesh and soul added to her shroud. The following night, their faces would appear among the rest. One evening, the remaining villagers gathered in the square, torches lit, desperate for a final stand. They whispered of fleeing together, believing perhaps strength in numbers might break the circle that kept them bound. But as they prepared, the bell rang again, louder than it ever had before. The sound rattled the cobbles beneath their feet, split wood beams, shattered glass. They dropped to their knees, clutching their heads, as the ringing deepened into a scream. From the end of the lane, she came. Her form filled the street, gown spreading wide, touching both sides of the houses. The torches dimmed as she drew near. The villagers raised them anyway, thrusting fire toward her, but the flames turned black, guttering into smoke. She advanced without haste, her head tilted, her mouth yawning wider, and from her throat poured the voices of every villager already taken. Husbands heard their wives, children heard their parents. Each voice begged in tones too familiar to resist. Some ran toward her in delirium, crying out for their lost kin. The gown swallowed them whole. Their screams joined the others before their feet even left the ground. Others fled, but the streets stretched endlessly, bending back toward the square. No matter how far they ran, they returned, panting and bleeding, to her waiting shape. Jonathan stood at her side now, his body twisted, joints bent backward, eyes black voids. His jaw hung loose, flesh stretched until it seemed ready to rip. When he opened his mouth, the scream that came was not his, but 100 voices layered at once. The villagers shrieked in despair, dropping their torches, covering their ears, but nothing dulled the sound. It pressed into their minds, splitting sanity like glass. The last attempt at resistance came from a boy, no older than 16, who hurled a sharpened iron rod into her chest. For a moment, it sank deep. For a heartbeat, the gown rippled as though wounded. Hope flickered. But then the cloth closed around the iron, absorbing it. The boy screamed as the same wound tore open in his chest, blood gushing, his ribs breaking outward. He was yanked from his feet, dragged into her folds, gone before anyone could help. The villagers broke then. Those who could still stand scattered, hiding in homes, in cellars, beneath floors. The square emptied, leaving only the Red Lady drifting forward, gowns sweeping across the stones, faces writhing in its folds, Jonathan staggering beside her, his hands hooked like claws. She stopped beneath the bell tower, Her head lifted and her mouth opened wider than ever before. The bell began to toll again, not by rope, not by hand, but by the force of her scream alone. Each strike shook the night. Each strike cracked the stones beneath her. The villagers cowered, clutching their ears until blood ran from them. The lady's gown spread wider, filling the square, pressing against the walls of the houses. And with every toll, the faces in her gown multiplied. The village was being absorbed, soul by soul, into her endless shroud. By dawn, the streets were empty. Doors swung open, beds unmade, meals half-eaten. No bodies remained. Only silence, broken by the creak of the bell that swayed in the wind. The manor still loomed above the hill, but now the village itself seemed part of it. Its houses slumped, its wells blackened, its windows glimmering faintly red as though each pane of glass was another mirror feeding her. The Red Lady had her village, and she was still hungry. By the 6th week, the village was no longer truly a village. The cobbled lanes lay cracked and black, as if veins of dried blood had risen to the surface. The cottages leaned inward, walls warped, their windows glimmering faintly red from within, though no candles burned. The well stood choked with clots. The church bell swayed without wind. The land itself seemed to pulse faintly, as though something beneath the stones still breathed. No one walked the streets, no livestock stirred, no laughter, no prayer, no hammer on nail. Only silence, deep and suffocating. Those few who had not yet been taken hid in the ruins of their homes, staring wide-eyed into the dark. They did not dare light lamps. They did not dare speak. They simply listened to the dragging sound, the steady rustle of silk against stone, as the Red Lady passed outside. Her gown flowed endlessly, spilling into alleys and courtyards, curling beneath doors. Faces swam across its folds, pressing outward, mouths opening in voiceless screams. Among them were husbands, wives, children, neighbors, all fused together, all still alive in some way too terrible to understand. Jonathan was no longer recognizable. He drifted beside her like a puppet, his limbs elongated, joints bending in grotesque angles. The remnants of his humanity flickered only in the glass, sometimes in a shattered window, sometimes in the gleam of water. For a fleeting instant, villagers would see his face there, eyes pleading, mouth forming the word, help. But when they looked at him directly, all that remained was the slack grin of a corpse and a jaw unhinged too wide to belong to any man. On the final night, the Red Lady ceased wandering the lanes. She stopped in the square, the bell tolling endlessly overhead, though no rope swayed. One by one, the last survivors were drawn from their homes, not by force, but by voices. A woman heard her dead child calling for her, begging to be held. A man heard his wife's laughter, the sound he had not heard since their wedding day. An old father heard his daughter's voice whispering that she was cold and needed him. The voices were irresistible. One by one, they stumbled into the streets, barefoot, pale, tears cutting paths down their dirt-caked faces. They followed the voices to the square where she waited. Her gown stretched wide enough to cover every doorway, every corner, a sea of red that rippled like something alive. The villagers gathered before her, trembling, yet unable to resist. She opened her mouth, and from it came not her own voice, but theirs, the voices of the newly arrived crying out in perfect imitation. The villagers dropped to their knees. Some crawled toward her, hands outstretched. Some simply bowed their heads, weeping, none resisted. The gown surged forward. It did not strike. It enveloped. It curled around them like a tide, dragging them down without a sound. Their screams did not leave their mouths. They rose from hers, blending into the endless chorus that had haunted the manor for centuries. Faces bloomed across her gown, each one etched in agony, each one mouthing silent words. The square filled with them. Walls shuddered as though echoing the weight of their suffering. The bell tolled until the tower split, stones raining down, but the sound did not cease. It continued to ring even from rubble. When the last villager was gone, silence returned. The Red Lady stood alone in the square, her gown twitching, bloated with the faces and bodies of her prey. Jonathan's face lingered near the hem, eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-scream. Slowly she turned. Her head tilted toward the manor on the hill. She began to ascend, dragging her gown behind her. The folds scraped across the cobbles, leaving trails that gleamed wet and dark in the moonlight. She entered through the manor's broken doors, and as she passed inside, the house shuddered, as though swallowing her whole. By dawn, the village was empty. The cottages remained, but no voices filled them. Beds lay unmade, meals half-eaten, toys abandoned mid-play. No footprints marked the earth. No fire smoldered in hearths. The well bubbled faintly with red, then stilled. The church bell, half buried in rubble, gave one final hollow toll before falling silent forever. Travelers passing months later found the village intact but lifeless. They walked its lanes calling out, but no answer came. They felt watched, though no eyes were seen. When they reached the square, they noticed the stones, blackened, cracked, and faintly pulsing if one dared to kneel close. No birds landed, no insects crawled, no weeds grew. The air smelled faintly of iron. Some said the village had been cursed by plague, others by famine, others still by madness. No one spoke of the Red Lady openly, but those who lingered at the inn in nearby towns might hear the whisper of her tale. And always it ended the same way. She keeps what is hers, and she does not let go. On nights when the fog rolls thick across the hills, travelers claim they can hear a bell tolling faintly in the distance. Those who follow the sound do not return, and those who try to leave find the roads curving back on themselves, the silhouette of a manor rising always on the horizon. The village still stands, though no maps mark it. The Red Lady still waits, her gown swelling with the voices of all who came before. And if you find yourself there, if you hear silk dragging across stone, if you hear a loved one calling your name from beyond the door, do not answer. Because if you do, you will not die. You will become part of the gown, forever. Thank you for listening. I kindly ask you to drop a like and subscribe and share this video with fellow horror story fan.